How am I making this podcast? Well, I'll tell you how. I'm making this podcast with Anchor FM. If you don't know what Anchor FM is, let me explain. First thing you need to know is that it is completely free. Anchor, as a podcasting platform, has creation tools that will allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Not only will Anchor distribute your podcast among its own platform, but also distribute your podcast for you so you can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. What's also great about it is that you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place. You can download the free Anchor app from the Google Play Store or the App Store, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Genesis. Introduction. The first phrase in the Hebrew text of 1:1 is Bereshith, in the beginning, which is also the Hebrew title of the book. Books in ancient times customarily were named after the first word or two. The English title, Genesis, is Greek in origin and comes from the word Genesio, which appears in the pre-Christian Greek translation of 2:4 and 5:1. Depending on its context, the word can mean birth, genealogy, or history of origin. In both its Hebrew and Greek forms, then, the traditional title of Genesis appropriately describes its contents, since it is primarily a book of beginnings. Chapters 1 through 38 reflect a great deal of what we know from other sources about ancient Mesopotamian life and culture. Creation, genealogies, destructive floods, geography and map-making, construction techniques, migrations of peoples, sale and purchase of land, legal customs and procedures, sheep herding and cattle raising. All these subjects and many others were matters of vital concern to the peoples of Mesopotamia during this time. They were also of interest to the individuals, families, and tribes of whom we read in the first 38 chapters of Genesis. The author appears to locate Eden, humankind's first home, in or near Mesopotamia. The Tower of Babel was built there. Abram was born there. Isaac took a wife from there, and Jacob lived there for 20 years. Although these patriarchs settled in Canaan, their original homeland was Mesopotamia. The closest ancient literacy parallels to Genesis 1 through 38 also come from Mesopotamia. In Numa Elish, the story of the god Marduk's rise to supremacy in the Babylonian pantheon is similar in some respects, though thoroughly mythical and polytheistic, to the Genesis 1 creation account. Some of the features of certain king lists from Sumner bear striking resemblance to the genealogy of Genesis 5. The 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic is quite similar in outline to the flood narrative in Genesis 6 through 8. Several of the major events in Genesis 1 through 8 are narrated in the same order as similar events in the Artaxerxes epic. In fact, the later features the same basic motif of creation, rebellion, flood as the biblical account. Clay tablets found in 1974 at the ancient site of Ebla, or modern Tel Morketh, in northern Syria, may also contain some intriguing parallels. Two other important sets of documents demonstrate the reflection of Mesopotamia in the first 38 chapters of Genesis. From the Mari letters, dating from the patriarchal period, we learn that the names of the patriarchs, including especially Abram, Jacob, and Job, were typical of that time. The letters also clearly illustrate the freedom of travel that was possible between various parts of the Amorite world in which the patriarchs lived. The Nuzi tablets, though a few centuries later than the patriarchal period, shed light on patriarchal customs, which tended to survive virtually intact for many centuries. the inheritance right of an adopted household member or slave, the obligation of a barren wife to furnish her husband with sons through a servant girl, structures against expelling such a servant girl and her son, the authority of oral statements in ancient Near Eastern law, such as the deathbed bequest, these and other legal customs, social contacts, and previous provisions are graphically illustrated in Mesopotamian documents. As Genesis 1 through 38 is Mesopotamian in character and background, so chapters 39 through 50 reflect Egyptian influence, though in not quite so direct a way. Examples of such influence are Egyptian grape cultivation, the riverside scene, Egypt as Canaan's breadbasket, Canaan as the source of numerous products for Egyptian consumption, Egyptian religious and social customs, Egyptian administrative procedures, Egyptian funerary practices, and several Egyptian words and names used throughout these chapters. The closest specific literary parallel from Egypt is the Tale of Two Brothers, which bears some semblance to the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Egyptian autobiographical narratives, such as the story of Sinui and the report of Renuim, and certain historical legends offer more general literacy parallels. Historically, Jews and Christians alike have held that Moses was the author-compiler of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. These books, known as the Pentateuch, mean 5-volume book, were referred to in Jewish tradition as the 5/5 of the Law of Moses. The Bible itself suggests Mosaic authorship of Genesis, since Acts 15:1 refers to circumcision as the custom taught by Moses, an allusion to Genesis 17. However, a certain amount of later editorial updating does appear to be indicated. The historical period during which Moses lived seemed to be fixed with a fair degree of accuracy by 1 Kings. We are told that the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel was the same as the 408th year after the Israelites had come out of Egypt. Since the former was around 966 BC, the later, and thus the date of the Exodus, was circa 1446, assuming that the 480 in 1 Kings 6:1 is to be taken literally. The 40-year period of Israel's wanderings in the desert, which lasted from circa 1446 to circa 1406, would have been the most likely time for Moses to write the book of what is today known as the Pentateuch. During the last 3 centuries, many interpreters have claimed to find in the Pentateuch 4 underlying sources. The presumed documents, allegedly dated from the 10th to 5th centuries BC, are called J for Yahweh, Yahweh, the personal original Old Testament name for God, E for Elohim, a generic name for God, D for Deuteronomic, and P for priestly. Each of these documents is claimed to have its own characteristics and its own theology, which often contradicts that of the other documents. The Pentateuch is thus depicted as a patchwork of stories, poems, and laws. However, this view is not supported by conclusive evidence, and intensive archaeological and literary research has tended to undercut many of the arguments used to challenge Mosaic authorship. Genesis speaks of beginnings, of the heavens and the earth, of light and darkness, of seas and skies, of land and vegetation, of sun and moon and stars, of sea and air and land animals, of human beings, made in God's own image, the climax of his creative activity, of marriage and family, of society and civilization, of sin and redemption. This list could go on and on. A key word in Genesis is account, which also serves to divide the book into its 10 major parts, and which include such concepts as birth, genealogy, and history. The book of Genesis is foundational to the understanding of the rest of the Bible. Its message is rich and complex, and listing its main elements gives a succinct outline of the biblical message as a whole. It is supremely a book that speaks about relationships, highlighting those between God and His creation, between God and humankind, and between human beings. It is thoroughly monotheistic, taking for granted that there is only one God worthy of the name, and opposing the ideas that there are many gods, polytheism, and that there is no God at all, atheism, and that everything is divine, pantheism. It clearly teaches that the one true God is sovereign over all that earth, and He often exercises His unlimited freedom to overturn human customs, traditions, and plans. It introduces us to the way in which God initiates and makes covenants with His chosen people, pledging His love and faithfulness to them, and calling them to promise theirs to Him. It establishes sacrifice as a substitution of life for life. It gives us the first hint of God's provision for redemption from the forces of evil, and contains the oldest and most profound statement concerning the significance of faith. More than half of Hebrews 1:1 and New Testament list of the faithful refers to characters in Genesis. The message of a book is often enhanced by its literary structure and characteristics. Genesis is divided into 10 main sections, each beginning with the word account. The first 5 sections can be grouped together and, along with the introduction to the book as a whole, can be appropriately called primeval history. This introduction to the main story sketches the period from Adam to Abraham and tells about the ways of God with the human race as a whole. The last 5 sections constitute a much longer but equally unified account and relate the story of God's dealings with the ancestors of His chosen people, Israel: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph and their families. A section often called patriarchal history. This section is in turn composed of 3 narrative cycles, interspersed by the genealogies of Ishmael and Esau. The narrative frequently concentrates on the life of a later son in preference to the firstborn: Seth over Cain, Shem over Japheth, Isaac over Ishmael, Jacob over Esau, Judah and Joseph over their brothers, and Ephraim over Manasseh. Such emphasis on divinely chosen men and their families is perhaps the most obvious literary and theological characteristic of the book of Genesis as a whole. It strikingly underscores the fact that the people of God are not the product of natural human developments, but are the result of God's sovereign and gracious intrusion in human history. He brings out of the fallen human race a new humanity consecrated to Himself, called and destined to be the people of His kingdom and a channel of His blessing to the whole earth. Numbers with symbolic significance figure prominently in Genesis. The number 10, in addition to being the number of sections into which Genesis is divided, is also the number of names appearing in the genealogies of chapters 5 and 11. The number 7 also occurs frequently. The Hebrew text of 1:1 consists of exactly 7 words, and that of 1:2 of exactly 14. There are 7 days of creation, 7 names in the genealogy of chapter 4, various 7s in the flood story, 70 descendants of Noah's son, a 7-fold promise to Abram, 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine in Egypt, and 70 descendants of Jacob. Other significant numbers such as 12 and 40 are used with similar frequency. The book of Genesis is basically prose narrative, punctuated here and there by brief poems. The longest is the so-called Blessing of Jacob in 49:2 through 27. Much of the prose has a lyrical quality and uses the full range of figures of speech and other devices that characterize the world's finest epic literature. Vertical and horizontal parallelism between the 2 sets of 3 days in the creation account The ebb and flow of sin and judgment in chapter 3. The powerful monotony of "and then he died" at the end of paragraphs in chapter 5. The climactic hinge effect of the phrase, "but God remembered Noah," at the midpoint of the flood story. The hourglass structure of the account of the Tower of Babel in 11:1-9. The macabre pun in 40:19. The alteration between brief accounts about firstborn sons and lengthy accounts about younger sons. These and numerous other literary devices add interest to the narrative and provide interpretive signals to which the reader should pay close attention. It is no coincidence that many of the subjects and themes of the first 3 chapters of Genesis are reflected in the last 3 chapters of Revelation. We can only marvel at the superintending influence of the Lord Himself, who assures us that all Scripture is God-breathed, and that the men who wrote it spoke from God as they were carried along by the Holy Spirit. If you liked this podcast, please feel free to like it on YouTube, as well as if you really do enjoy it, give listener support on Anchor.fm.